everyone. My name is Erin Meyer. I am the Sustainable Food Programs Coordinator at UC Merced. I coordinate all things food waste and food recovery. So the Bobcat Eats Food Waste Awareness and Prevention Program, the People's Fridge, the Pop-Up People's Pantry, a few other things. And as a part of some virtual events, we are hosting AMAs as well as panel discussions. And UC Merced has a fantastic researcher studying soil, which has a lot to do with climate change and food and ag. And so we've invited her to be on our panel today. So hopefully you all were able to watch the TED Talk and read some of her work and the animation and everything. But I'm very excited about this particular panel. So I think I will give it over to Alasia, who can introduce herself. She is today's moderator. And then we'll have our very special guest introduce herself as well too. So Alasia, do you want to go ahead and take it away?
Yes, so my name's Alasia Wheatley. I am the Zero Waste Coordinator for UC Merced. I also am a UC Merced alumni. I deal with everything that involves waste, whether that be compost, landfill recycling, the signage on campus. That's what I deal with. And that's me. So take it away, Asmeret.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Asmeret Asefaw Berhe, and I am currently a Professor of Soil Biogeochemistry at the Department of Life and Environmental Sciences here at UC Merced. I'm also the Interim Associate Dean for Graduate Education right now. I'm a soil scientist by training, and a lot of my work deals with trying to improve our understanding of the roles that soil plays in climate change and how it's affected by climate change. But we also deal with a whole range of other, some related issues to that and others, including large-scale questions about how wide-scale use, abuse, and overuse of soil contributes to degradation and the implications of that, not just for the ability of soil to support agricultural productivity, but also even human security and national security type of considerations. Yeah, I like everything about soil. I think soil is beautiful, soil is incredible, and soil makes life possible. So yeah, I like soil. I think that's a fair statement. Yeah, and I think I was born and raised in Eritrea. Maybe I could start there, I think, in East Africa. It's a really wonderful place on the coast of the Red Sea. But I've lived actually pretty much all my adult life in the US. Been here for a while is what that means without talking about numbers. Yeah, and I received my graduate education first at Michigan State University, and then later at UC Berkeley, and then did postdoctoral research after I received my doctorate at both UC Berkeley and UC Davis. Yeah, and then I guess we'll get to the rest.
Yes. So what would you say is the most important thing about soil?
The most important thing about soil, if I had to pick one, I would have to say that it regulates life. That's really one of the really key things we have to remember, right? What makes our planet unique compared to all the other planets in the solar system and beyond is that our planet can support life. And a big part of why our planet started with supporting life and why it continues to support life has to do with soil and the ability of soil to provide the nutrients that life needs, to serve as home for all of those diverse and abundant microbial species, for example, really growing pretty much all the food that human communities and all living communities on land depend on. So there's really no life. It's not an exaggeration to say that thin veil of soil that covers the Earth's surface really represents the difference between life and lifelessness in the Earth's system. There was famous soil scientist from University of Wisconsin, Madison, who used to say, and is pretty popular for saying that we are all just temporarily not soil. So all life on land basically is just temporarily not soil. We came from soil, we're going to go to soil. And it's not really the religious connotation that he's going after here. It's the fact that life cannot happen without soil and the nutrition and the minerals and the support that soil provides. And when we die, our bodies also go back there to be, decomposed by activity of microbes that live in soil. And in the process, release the nutrients that are in our body and make them available for the next generation of microbes and plants. So I don't know, that's a catchy one, right? Temporarily not soil.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there's more than twice as much carbon in soil than there is in all of the world's vegetation and air. Some people / groups advocate for widespread reforestation as a climate change solution, where others dismiss it. Where do you stand?
So I think that's an I have to give a nuanced answer to this, right? Nobody is against forests. Nobody is against protecting forests. But I think thinking that forests are the only solutions we need is a bit unrealistic. Let's start from the fact that there is a climate envelope in which forests thrive. And there are a big part of the world where the climate conditions are not conducive for trees to grow, for forests to thrive. So those ecosystems have also their own value, from an ecological standpoint, and also a human, cultural, and all other standpoints. So I don't like people arguing that forestry should be the answer to everything and that we should forest everything, because one of the studies that popularized this idea, in the analysis that they did, they assumed that the whole world could basically be forested, including places like the Yellowstone, including incredibly diverse places like the Cerrado in Brazil, the native grasslands, and the savanna in Africa. So I don't think that's a helpful strategy. First of all, forests can't thrive there. And second, those ecosystems have their own value. And it's also important to remember that in many cases, there are very, very many documented cases where native prairie and grasslands can actually promote quite a large amount of carbon sequestration in soil. So you don't need forests everywhere. And I don't think there's any reason for us to be pigeonholed into one option. That there's a whole lot of options on the table that we have to choose from based on what's appropriate for the environment that we're working in. Forests are an important part of that conversation because avoided deforestation, as well as putting back forests whenever we can with afforestation, are both incredibly important strategies for carbon sequestration, but they're not the only one, not by a long shot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So if anyone else has questions, feel free to stop me, put it in the chat. If you don't, I will continue to ask questions. So what type of data do you have to look into when checking into soil's health?
A lot of different things. So one of the things is it's like human health, right? There is no one single data point that's going to tell the doctor that you're healthy. The doctor has to assess a whole lot of things to know whether we're healthy and how our health across multiple dimensions is changing over time. Soil health is a very similar idea. So that when we're assessing the health of the soil ecosystem, we can think about the amount of microbial life it's supporting, for example, how fast plants can grow, how nutritious, or how much nutrients available, you could say, for the plants to grow. You can think about its ability to hold on to water. So its water holding capacity, its nutrient holding capacity, the abundance of available nutrients that plants could take up in the forms that plants need them for uptake. in the distributions and amounts that plants need them for uptake. So that's called the principle of soil fertility. You can think about amount of carbon the soil stores. All of these are in the indices of soil health. But if we're really going to assess the health of the soil ecosystem, though, we really have to take a holistic approach that looks at a bunch of these variables. Some of them are physical variables, some are chemical, and some are biological variables, and be able to also observe them over time so that we know how things, so first of all, we establish baselines, and then we know how things are changing. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does someone have a question? I think that's probably an echo from my mic. How can we as consumers and just citizens, people in general, better expose and promote the use of soil to help climate change?
So there's a lot that we could do. I will try to give a few examples maybe, right? To start with, I think we have to recognize that the economic and political systems that we have do not incentivize protecting soil health, or even rehabilitating degraded soils, right? So we have, for example, relatively speaking, very cheap food and abundance of certain types of foods and grains and vegetables in the markets, to a point where they're way more than anybody could use them. At least in the local communities, for example, in the US. And part of that is those perverse incentive structures that we've built up, right? So as a whole society, we have to stop and think about what we're doing there. Are we really helping the communities in the long term, helping the soil ecosystem and its health, when we push people into certain types of production systems, or even when we're incentivizing soil, for example, sometimes in an effort to protect soils and their health, there are incentives built in for farmers to not till their land, but they could put them in fallows so that the nutrient status of the soil can recover, its structural stability can recover. But a lot of times those structures might not necessarily actually be built in a way that farmers can get back to that system when they need to, and to get back to kind of using the land and protecting it, hopefully. A big part of the problem, though, to me, is the cost of food and how much we're willing to pay for food, and also the large amount of waste that is generated from agricultural systems and the food production system in general. The food production system that we have right now relies on delivery of large amount of irrigation water, right? In some cases at the expense of pumping groundwater systems empty. It relies on application of large amounts of agricultural chemicals, not just the pesticides and the fungicides and herbicides in general, but also fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers. All of those we know are hugely problematic from a perspective of greenhouse gas fluxes to the atmosphere, from a perspective of polluting surface water and groundwater systems, from the perspective of soil health in general. So we have to, as a whole, as a society, be willing to pay farmers fair price for the items that they produce in sustainable manner, for systems that don't rely on these hugely destructive practices, right? We can't just expect them to all turn organic one day or something like that, right? That's not realistic. But we have to be able to help them transition towards those more sustainable approaches. And we have to be willing to play our part, right? To be willing to play our part so that we are paying a fair price, we are paying the farmers and be willing to compensate them for the efforts they put in towards protecting soil health. There's a lot of discussions around the policy. So the Farm Bill that is in consideration, for example, the revisions to the Farm Bill have incentives for that, for practices that could build up carbon in soil, which is one metric of health, right? There's also businesses out there, multiple actually, that are considering a labeling scheme that's similar to the USDA organic label, but for soil health. And that would be one way where we could put our money where our mouth is, right? If we say we care about soil and soil health, we could choose products that were produced in farms that were sustainably managed, looking at soil health. It's not clear how fast these things might get into the market, but they've been in discussion for a while now. And there's some big players even in the food space, including some of the cereal companies, for example, that are seriously looking into these issues. So it looks like it's out there. It's being considered, many other things. And of course, you've heard about carbon trading that is out there, that a lot of people are looking into how we could use, kind of build up of soil carbon, which is a way of rehabilitating the degraded agricultural lands, in particular in conventional agricultural systems, how we could use that practice to build up carbon in soil and use those for carbon offsets for climate change. There's a lot of corporations that are willing to pay for carbon offset, in particular for forestry and soil-related processes and grassland remediation type of projects too. So I think all of these things in many ways are important ways to start thinking about how could we be playing a role here when we're not directly involved in agriculture or land management for that matter. I will say, though, that every single one of us can do better with the thing that you know a lot about, with reducing food waste, right? Yeah. We could all do better about making sure we're cognizant of how much food we're throwing away, and how much waste is overall generated in the food production and transportation and delivery business. And that could go a long way towards protecting the soil health, and that we don't need any policy for that, right? It's an individual action that we need in many ways. I mean, obviously we need policy. I don't mean policy is not important. I just mean we don't need to wait for somebody to come up with policy to enforce that. We can actually, enforce it really strongly in our own homes, in our own domains, wherever we are. All right.
I love that answer. So important. So because soil, well, I recently watched a film called Sequester, and it mentions that oceans is being one of the best ways to sequester carbon. How do oceans compare to soil in their ability to sequester carbon?
So to answer this question, allow me to take a step back and talk about the amount of carbon released to the atmosphere and how much goes where. So keep in mind that human actions at this point are releasing something close to about 10 petagrams of carbon to the atmosphere. We're talking about 10 billion with a B metric tons of carbon to the atmosphere. A larger fraction of that is from fossil fuel emissions. All the fossil fuel we're burning in industry and cars and generating electricity and everything else. But about 20% of that is from the way we use land. So intensive tillage and agricultural practices, deforestation, and things like that. So, but keep that number 10 in mind, right? We release about 10 billion metric ton. But if you actually look at the data by how much the atmospheric concentration of CO2 is increasing every year, for example, that's roughly equal to half of that number. The reason that that number is only half is because 50% of the extra carbon we're releasing to the atmosphere is actually being taken up by natural ecosystems. About 25% is taken up by oceans. The other 20, actually the number is closer to about 22% is taken up by the ocean right now. And a little bit more than half is being taken up by the terrestrial ecosystem, so by land. So the natural ecosystems in combination, both the land and the ocean, are taking up roughly equal amounts of carbon, that extra carbon we're releasing into the atmosphere, and sequestering it either in the ocean or in forests, in land, in grasslands, in soil, and everything else on the terrestrial ecosystem. So at some point, you could say you can compare the relative size of land area on the globe versus the oceans and reach at a conclusion that land is a lot more effective than ocean, is what we're saying, right, at some level. And the other way to think about it is also the fact that we're fairly certain about the ocean's potential. We are also seeing the drastic impact suffered by the ocean when it takes more and more carbon from the atmosphere, because that causes warming, that comes with acidification and bleaching and large scale effects to aquatic life in general, and processes in the ocean that could even affect the large scale circulation patterns. So we're fairly certain, I think in the climate community, people are pretty certain that we are not only reaching the safe limits for the ocean, we could even be pushing it past that point. But it's pretty clear that there is still a large potential to sequester large amounts of carbon on land. We could do that, for example, if we just replace the carbon that's lost from soil with intensive cultivation systems or deforestation. And so the numbers are basically that, like in the last 200 years alone, in conventional agricultural systems, we released some, in combination in the last 200 years, on the order of about 120 billion metric tons of carbon to the atmosphere. That's all carbon that was accumulating in soil throughout Earth's history, that once we adopted, passed right after the Industrial Revolution, we got pretty good at destroying the soil stability, right? Because of the mechanization and things like that happened. And all of that caused so much deforestation and so much tillage that released 120 billion metric tons of carbon to the atmosphere, just from soil. We're not even talking about the amount lost from biomass right now. So you can imagine that if we just try to recover that much, not even extra, if we just try to recover that much, we could be well on our way to actually address this issue. A lot of people would tell you that recovering that amount over short periods of time is a non-trivial exercise. And in fact, it's pretty hard. But there's these global assessments out there that have suggested, for example, that if we can add enough carbon into the soil annually with regenerative agriculture and all of these other natural climate change solutions that we can implement, if we can increase the amount of carbon stored in soil by just 0.4% every year, 4 per mil, not even 0.5%. We're not even talking about 0.5%, 0.4% every year for the foreseeable future, we would be able to offset 1/3 of all the carbon we're releasing into the atmosphere, the excess carbon we're releasing into the atmosphere from fossil fuels every year. And that, in many parts of the world, is an achievable goal. We could do that. And doing so is also, the nice thing is doing so is also great, not just for improving the climate system and helping address the climate change crisis that we all have to worry about, but it's also really important because that allows the soil health to build back to where it was, right? Because a soil that has more carbon is soil that can store and make available water and nutrients to plants that could grow there. And when the plants grow, eventually their residue or their biomass and the biomass of the organisms that feed on them also returns to soil. So it restores the health of the soil system. And so that's a long way of saying that, yes, the ocean also has potential, but we have much more feasible and much more realistic paths on land than we have on trying to overburden the ocean even more than it is right now. And I don't think I'm saying that because I'm a soil scientist. I think ocean biogeochemists would back me up on that.
We will. So you mentioned soil degradation affects, the lives of animals, plants, and us. What areas in the world is soil segregation more prevalent than other areas, because we know it doesn't affect, well, maybe it does, maybe it'll tell me, but my hypothesis is that it doesn't affect everyone the same. It possibly does affect everyone differently, and other places are having it worse than some.
Yeah. I mean, there are parts of the world that are affected way more. So as a rule of thumb, areas that have been cultivated for long periods of time in human history have the most degraded soil. So for example, based on that history, soils across the sub-Saharan region of Africa are super degraded compared to everywhere else, because they've experienced, settled agriculture and intensive production systems for way longer than many other parts of the world. And they've also had the population density to kind of help in there in that respect, if you will. But there's also long history of soil degradation, for example, in places like the Middle East, when the climate changed after the Young Dryas, we're talking about a long time ago, near the end of, for example, of the last glacial period. There's a large-scale ecosystem shift that happened that caused people to settle, start cultivating, and they very quickly degraded their soils. And soil degradation in that part of the world, in fact, is one of the main reasons that is given for why the civilizations in the Middle East collapsed quite prematurely. Because they not only settled and became powerful and they started farming and things like that, but rather quickly, because they were relying on irrigation with hard water that had a lot of ions dissolved in it, they caused salinity problems in their soils. They caused major issues with chemical pollution of their soil that caused near collapse of their agricultural systems. So there's a lot of evidence like that. There's tons of evidence in the central parts of the US, for example, for soil degradation, including areas that were affected, when people settled and started cultivating and not necessarily being careful about how they were tilling the land and how they were destroying the land and not covering it with, vegetation for long periods of time when it's and things like that caused the Dust Bowl, right? That's a major part of US history of how soil degradation really altered the path of US history in many ways, right? And think about the fact, I like to tell my students also to have them imagine what happened to all those farmers that were farming and living off of the land in areas that were affected by the Dust Bowl. Because many of them don't actually necessarily, they've heard of the Dust Bowl as part of a mythical history they've read somewhere else, but they don't actually think they have a connection. And we talk about then how big chunk of those farmers that moved to the Central Valley. Guess what they did? They facilitated quite large scale draining of formerly wetland areas, because those are soils that are super productive if they were drained. And that caused also the large scale change in soils across the Central Valley that happened because of agriculture. And we talk about a lot, I feel like we talk a lot more about how the Central Valley is the breadbasket of the country in a lot of everything that we do, right, in this region. But we don't talk a lot about how that was made possible. That was made possible by, really at the heart of it, degradation of wetland soils, right? These really super productive wetland soils that incredibly rich in terms of carbon, nutrients, fertility, ability to hold on to water. If you look at the soils right now, there's very little resemblance to those wetland soils that would have been in this area, many years ago. But it's important to recognize that wherever there is large-scale agriculture, in particular conventional agricultural systems, in particular industrialized agriculture that has to work with especially annual monocultures and an annual cultivated system, then soil degradation is part of the story. Unless, of course, those land managers are being super careful about protecting their land with cover crops, rotations, terraces, and everything else that goes into best management practices to ensure that the soil is recovering in terms of its nutrients, not getting eroded, it's not getting blown away by wind, and that the fertility is also maintained. Yeah, long answer, but wherever there is intensive agriculture, whenever you've also heard quite a bit about, for example, the Amazon region, for example, where large swaths of forests that are even hard to imagine getting deforested on a regular basis to make way for agriculture. Right. The same thing you could talk about, Southeast Asia and many countries in Asia, in the wetter parts is obviously what we're talking about beyond the Middle East, that have also experienced large scale degradation. China is an incredible example of, for example, how when their economy started growing and the Green Revolution facilitated, production of so much food that the community was able to depend on. But the result of that was also large-scale soil degradation. So since the 80s, especially, the government of China has actually been actively working on addressing issues of soil degradation and erosion in a major way, and that they've transformed their agricultural areas quite incredibly. You could say the same across some areas in the Midwest, for example, in the US too, where policy interventions have helped to restore soils that were experiencing major pressures from agriculture, conventional intensive agricultural production systems.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Hi.
Hi.
So when we were looking at, so organic matter, we look at, I've got a good friend of mine that came from the Midwest, and he'd pull core samples underneath where the railroad had been, right, where they removed it, and they would see 13%, 12, 13% organic matter. Is that relationship the same with carbon sequestration? I mean, are those high carbon soils, or is that because here probably our ground, right around this area, that's farmed is probably less than 1.5%. And so I think we are trying to do, cover crops and stuff. Is that our best foot forward, on like the permanent crops and things that we're doing? I mean, if you were to write a prescription on, and I was growing vineyards or almonds, what would that look like? Yeah.
So your friend is in the Midwest?
He was. Yeah.
Would this be in areas that would have had native prairie?
It was all native. On? Yeah.
So the reason why so go ahead, I'll let you finish and then I'll explain why that is.
Ironically though, we opened up some ground, and you do things that you don't know, you know what I mean? And we've in the western part of Madera County, there was some ground that had been in, it was a Fresno Pico loam. It had been just cattle grazing ground, pretty much prairie grass. When we pulled those cores, we pulled 10-foot cores on it, and we saw up to 10, 12% organic matter there. The ground smelled amazing, you know what I mean? But so the question I guess I got is that how do we get back there? I mean, how do we start doing the right things? Yeah,
so one of the things that makes those native prairie systems so just incredible in terms of their ability to restore soil health and organic matter and structural stability of soil and its ability to hold water and everything is that they have very extensive rooting systems, right? Deep, extensive rooting systems. And by virtue of having that, what that means then is they put so much of their photosynthetic production below ground into the roots, and the roots then spend a lot of time and energy trying to modify the soil environment to work for them. And in that effort, they release these organic compounds, the sugars and the exudates into the soil. All of that is carbon that's accumulating in soil, right? So it supports a thriving microbial community. And yes, there's a faster turnover of organic matter and microbes, but in the process, it contributes so much more to the soil carbon storage. I like to explain to people the carbon storage idea in soil as being something akin to a bank. So think about the fact that, the balance that we see at any given point is a balance between how much we deposited and how much we took out, we withdrew from the bank, right? And then most of us have a checking account and a saving account. And in the checking account, we put in a lot of money, but it's used to pay the bills, right? And so a lot of it goes back out again. But in the saving account, even if we stash just a little bit of money all the time, then it could help build a balance over long periods of time. And what we should really be trying to do in soil when we're managing soil for carbon sequestration is to figure out a way where we can contribute carbon to both of these pools, right? We need to be able to feed the plants with the resources they need. We need to feed the microbes to keep the system active and healthy. So we need to put in, we need to allow for that soil to be able to cycle through some of that carbon rather fast. This would be mostly the particulate pieces of organic carbon. But most soil also have, clay particles, which are actually very reactive from a chemical perspective. And when carbon finds itself in association or near these clay particles, it forms either chemical or physical association. Either it's trapped inside aggregates formed by those clays or facilitated formation of aggregates by those clays, or it chemically gets bound to the surfaces of these minerals. And when it does, that's what we're talking about with the savings account. So we need to figure out, in mechanisms that are able to provide a lot of carbon that goes into soil, but then is able to feed both of these things. Conventional agriculture is tricky in this space because you might very well be adding a lot of carbon to the soil, but then we harvest the material first of all. So a lot of carbon never returns to soil, but then we till it in an annual system in particular. And that tillage increases the rate at which carbon is lost. So not much carbon gets returned into the soil and not much nutrients get recycled back, right? So we have to constantly be adding nutrients from fertilizers and all that. But what these, kind of native prairie type of systems do though, is they kind of shortcut the need to continuously be supplementing with synthetic fertilizers and other things, right? Because they're facilitating this rather natural cycling of organic matter that makes nutrients available. Any annual system or even any perennial system that doesn't invest a lot of carbon in the below ground setting is not going to be able to do that, right? So one of the major prescriptions that people talk about is intercropping with grasses, in particular perennial grasses, which, from my idealistic soil science stance it would be great if every farmer considering almond and vineyards and everything else could do that, because I know there are benefits there to the soil, right? Which in the long term will help the farm. But I also have to recognize the fact that putting in, perennial grasses that you want to maintain in between those nice rows of vineyards is a hassle to deal with from a management point of view. And it's a time-intensive exercise, right? For you all have to figure out a way to pay people to handle each and every one of these things manually, and it makes mechanization of agriculture hard. So cost becomes prohibitive. But so at some point we have to reconcile, I guess, that my message is what is good for the soil versus what is the cheapest and most economically feasible path for managing the land. And I think in many ways, traditional agricultural communities had always done that, right? They always facilitated returning the residue and waste products into land because that's what they depended on. They didn't have Haber-Bosch process to produce nitrogen fertilizer or something like that. And so that nitrogen had to come from waste sources so that it could be recycled. And when the residue is retained, returned it, put it back, the nitrogen or the nitrogen fixing, forbs or grass, legumes in general, would allow that soil to recover that way. So this is where I think there has to be, and again, every system's different based on climate and soil and the need of what you're trying to grow. But at some point, figuring out a way how we can best reconcile the needs of, keeping the farm economically, profitable, obviously, but also infusing some of these practices that we know help build the soil's carbon and nutrient stocks and health and in all sorts of different ways. There's a lot of effort, for example, across the US right now to put in place things like biofuel crops such as switchgrass in intercropping systems or even by themselves. And the idea there is basically to do that because, switchgrass is notorious for having and similar other biofuels crops too, notorious for having these really deep, extensive root systems. It grows bigger below ground than it does above ground, right? And so it's just incredible and phenomenal in many ways when you think about it.
Thank you. Is there a way to realistically, calculate carbon? I mean, how much you're putting back in? I mean, are there measurement tools? I mean, a lot of times when we'll pull soil samples, right? We can pull a sample on one day and then pull it from almost the same spot 3 days later, and the lab results come back somewhat variant. And maybe just the processes of the lab. But those are concerns, I guess, I've got a little bit of, us being able, I mean, I love the idea, and obviously I'm with the RCD as well as farming. So our goal in the San Joaquin Valley is in the next 5 years to have 1 million acres of cover crops. That would be the right thing. And part of that whole system needs to be for us is the ability not to use too much water, but have it at the right time so that those roots do bring that water back into the soil, right? It rains over the winter, we're able to have those soils opened up, put it back in. So we've been trying to do permanent cover crops. We've got a field day, I think it's in 2 or 3 weeks here. And so we've got growers are actually pushing like they do in Australia. They're using an auger and pushing it into the centers, to start reducing weed pressure. So those are the things, like you say, that we have to struggle with, but there's got to be ways that we can do that. But then the question becomes, how do we measure how much carbon we're actually sequestering? Is there a tried and true method that we can trust?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of our bread and butter, for example, in our lab. That's what we do, right? But we are by no means unique. There are a lot of labs, even within UC Merced, that do this, let alone in other institutions. There are a number of labs. But the issue, I think, that almost always becomes a point of contention is that we have to recognize that soil is inherently variable. It's different from one place to another, right? Because the properties of soil depend on climate, they depend on organisms that are there, they depend on topography, and they depend on time the soil has been. So these variables that we affectionately call in soil science as CLORT, or state factors of soil formation that regulate the nature of soil. Having said that, what becomes a problem when folks are trying to determine carbon is whether we actually have developed an adequate sampling strategy that gives us a representative mean or average number. Because as you said, if you measure it in one spot here and another spot, even the same day, you're likely going to see differences. So when we're measuring carbon content in soil from a perspective of trying to publish it in journals, for example, we can never do that. We have to always be able to sample in replicated sampling scheme, and we have to adopt that replicated sampling scheme to the complexity of the landscape. And so based on all those properties, we have to design an experimental, the experimental design has to factor in how complex is the terrain, how variable are the soil properties, and how much variability is also okay for us to detect change, right? Especially from a management perspective. All of this having said, the amount of carbon you have in soil in terms of percent is not going to change significantly between 1 day and 3 days if you're actually getting the right value. What is actually happening is that you're hitting spots that have inherent variability because you can't go back to the same spot, right? It's like a river. You can't step in the same water twice in a river, right? So you can't sample the same spot that you already took the core out of. So you go into another spot, and inherently that next stop might very well be super different. And a lot of the sampling schemes, especially the ones that I've seen, you mentioned earlier that you dug like 10 foot. That's not really common in managed landscapes. When people are trying to detect change, they're usually doing it in the top 30 centimeter, the plow layer. And that could be super misleading because some practices can actually push carbon deeper into the soil. Some practices can change bulk density. And bulk density and carbon percent are integral parts of how you calculate how much mass of carbon you have in soil. And so you need to know how the bulk density is changing. You need to have a fairly accurate measure, or at least representative measure of bulk density and carbon, which all boils down to carefully sampling your land in recognition for the complexity of the landscape. At the very least, if you can't design a specific sampling scheme for your design, if you don't have the people with the statistical expertise to do that, the rule of thumb is at least make sure you have enough replicates that you think are capturing the variability that you can observe with your own eye.
You can see that variability in, the size of the tree, the leaf, but all of our fields are Verised. We use a Veris mapping tool, or an EM38. So we're doing electroconductivity, looking at that variability and then pulling the cores on the variability, right?
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
So it is, our resolution is at least decent, but again, those nuances and those are the things that we're paying attention to. But as I watch, this regenerative ag spread across the country, and I've got a good friend that's a great organic farmer, and he struggles. Like you said, once you disc, you end up burning off you burn out the carbon, right? So in an organic environment, that's their tool for controlling weeds, right? So you've got to, that match is kind of interesting, when you start talking about regenerative versus organic versus conventional. We're trying to land on those things. And so one of the things that I'd like to experiment with is to put tangerines, and then put it into a cell grazing where I rotate cattle through. How important is it for cattle to be, a part of that, that strategy for increasing carbon? Or some type of clothed hoof animal. What's that integration look like?
There are some studies out. I should clarify one thing, and I'm going to get back to grazing in a minute. Whenever you're getting those carbon numbers from the areas that you sample for, based on the variability that you observe, are you always relying on the averages of the numbers from those areas then, or are you looking at those numbers individually?
Individually.
Yeah, see, that I think I would go with average. So whenever we're reporting the data from the replicated samples, we always have to do the average and then give in plus or minus the error around our estimate. And then only when the variability is big enough compared to the error that we're capturing can we actually say a management scheme has caused a change in carbon storage. So that is, I think, an important fundamental thing that I just didn't want us to pass. When it comes to grazing, there's some studies out there that indicate that integration of animals in a production system could facilitate higher carbon storage. But ultimately, with or without animals, grasses, especially those perennial extensive grasses with extensive rooting system, those are really what are making the biggest contribution to carbon storage. So what is essential is to make sure that we're incorporating those grasses and those nitrogen fixing plants, and that build both carbon and nitrogen in soil. animals is a different beast, because if you're really thinking about this from a climate perspective, you also have to consider what happens with the methane the animals release, cattle in particular, right? You also have to consider if if they're not free range. If they're free range and their waste is being spread into the soil, then it's actually better. It will help build organic matter and nutrients in soil. But if they're going to be kept in, kind of more groups, in structures, and then the waste has to be cleared and put in lagoons and kind of separated and all that business, that releases a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So at some point, we have to consider whether adding animals is, as a whole in the system, causing more carbon to be sequestered in soil while facilitating large amount of greenhouse gases, including methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas, to keep getting released to the atmosphere.
For us, in that system, it's going to be grass-fed beef. There'll be no confinement, and it'll be in a rotation. But what I struggle with, in these vineyards and these almonds are, the weed pressure that we have. So, we've got these, all these herbicides that we use. And I know that there's degradation happening to those, and of the soil. And so I struggle, I've got a 14 strip, or a 14-foot strip of, in the almonds of, of a cover crop that stays permanent, that we never disc. But then on the berms, we're spraying and that makes it problematic. So my idea was this, with this integration with cattle or sheep or whatever, would to keep those weeds down in a way that I wouldn't be using, a whole lot of herbicide pressure. So, it's there's so many things to be answered, but
yep.
The soil health thing is just absolutely, and I think a lot of people are actually having fun again, putting cover crops in, because, there's, in the cover crops we're using, there's, 17 varieties of different species, and so, and so it's been good. I think there's a pretty good movement.
I think it's going to help, right? We've seen how the way things were done in the past got us to this point. And if we're going to keep demanding that the soil provides the food, feed, and everything else that we need from it, then we're going to have to figure out a way that we replenish the nutrients and the carbon and the ability of that soil to support production systems. And I'm really kind of excited to see the widespread adoption and discussions around regenerative agriculture and cover crops and things like that. It can only help, right? The economic benefits might not be realized in the short term. And that's always a tricky conversation, right? Because we have to have an eye on the long term when we're talking about these practices. It didn't, that degradation of soil didn't happen overnight. So the reclamation is not going to happen overnight either. But, we're all humans. We all would like to see a return on investment. So that's always a tricky conversation to have. To realize those investments and their benefits, I should say, in the short term. But I see you for it. Yep.
Well, we've been here 100 years, and I want to see it go another 100. So I got to change what I'm doing. You know what I mean? And it's.
You say 100, and I'm gonna raise you more. I want it to keep going.
Yeah, I do too. I agree. Yeah, I agree 100%. You're absolutely right. You know what I mean? It's so important, and I do think that as a family farmer, I do think that it makes it a lot easier for me to see that return,
Yep.
And then, not only that, but just the biology as far as, pollinators and, those are all the things that we really got to think about.
Yeah, it's always fascinating for me when I talk to, we come at these discussions from obviously largely academic standpoint. And it's always fascinating to me to talk to people who are actually doing the day-to-day managing of the land. And in particular, folks like you that are constantly trying to learn about how can I do right by the land, so that not only can I get what I need from my livelihood, but I'm also hopefully be able to inherit this land and this area to my, my kids and their kids and future kids and all that. And I love it. I enjoyed this conversation. There was a farmer, you probably know him, Tom Willie, who's retired, kind of retired.
Guy. Yeah, he's the guy I was talking about. Yeah, he's one of my good friends. Yeah.
He's fascinating. I've enjoyed kind of talking to him and taking students and postdocs that work with me to his farm and hearing him talk about the different production systems that he has to follow so that he could avoid using chemicals is an incredible lesson of biological protection, right? Like it's a quite real incredible, but he also keeps up with the literature on what's going on with the soil microbiology and nutrient cycling and carbon and regenerative ag. And so I always enjoy these conversations because there's a good amount of realism along with the experience and knowledge about the land that is injected into the conversation. And sometimes it's helpful to check our idealistic academic notions when we're dealing with actually real humans managing real land in ways that have to make a difference right now.
It's well, and Tom's a good one, and then he's got a good friend, John Texera. John farms there. So the John farms conventional, where Tom just is, he's a straight organic grower. But I would be interested in your lab. Can we bring samples to you? I mean, is that something that's on the radar?
So we're not a pay facility. We don't have that capability. Like, I assume you send your samples to Davis, right? Is that what you do?
We send them to J.M. Lord here in Fresno.
Okay, so we're not like a paid facility that charges people. Occasional sample analysis, a few people here and there is fine, but we don't have the capability to work for pay for people, mainly because the university has strict rules about how we charge for different services and all that kind of thing. But if you have we're happy to talk more about a few samples here and there. We could make it work. But if you have a more need to send samples to a similar lab, there is a facility at UC Davis that actually follows the exact protocols that we use, and they are set up to accept samples from community and other researchers to be able to run them there. It's called the Davis Analytical Lab. Okay. And so we could talk more, and I'll tell you about our lab and then the Davis one if you want.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
So love the conversation, but sadly we'll be coming to our end. So last question, and you kind of touched on this already, but how can we as ordinary people support farmers and support this regenerative new phase of soil?
Yeah, as I said earlier, right? I think we could do a lot to help them if we first of all be willing to pay for the higher cost of those regenerative practices and the investments that they have to make that work, and the people that they have to pay, the time that has to go into it. We can also be advocates for those practices and policy interventions to make those practices possible and feasible for them. So we could play a political role in advocacy and voting to support the communities, obviously. We could also push for, in kind of more economic sense, push for those kinds of labeling schemes that we were talking about earlier, right? Ones that identify kind of the farms that are able to manage their soil sustainably. The only way that's done locally right now is by supporting CSAs, getting a box of veggies or fruits or whatever that you need. And there's many really awesome options for that, or even farmers markets and things like that, which are a direct way to engage with the farming community and support. But if we want this to go a long way, though, instead of just, buying some of our stuff in the farmer's market or from a CSA box, we really have to exert a bit more pressure on the economic and political systems to make it possible for farmers to earn, fair compensation for the work that goes into it, and stop expecting super cheap food that if we keep doing that, it's going to have to come at the expense of environmental health. And we all can stop doing that, right? And of course, avoid waste. How could I forget waste? Avoid waste. So that.
That's absolutely right.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming out to our event. Thank you, Asmeret, for taking your time out of your day to come explain to us about soil. So grateful.
Thank you all. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Erin, Alex, and everybody, just really nice.
Thank you. And I learned soil much. The pun. And I think that might be a good segue. Just, can you show us your shirt, please?
Yes.
Oh, so I'm wearing a shirt that says, I cared about climate before it was hot.
That's beautiful. That's perfect.
So on that note, with the laughter, I think we'll wrap this up. Thank you again for attending. I will share out this recording via YouTube and everything, and you can expect that in your email inbox shortly. So thank you all. Have a fantastic evening and a great weekend too.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.